And the gravy boat didn't just tip over, it was swept off the table by my father's backhand, shattering against the hardwood floor. And brown sludge splattered onto the pristine white cuffs of my dress shirt. The china crunched under his boot as he stepped closer to me, and his face a mottled map of rage and cranberry sauce. The heat in the dining room was suffocating, smelling of overcooked turkey and expensive merlot, and my mother sat at the other end of the mahogany table, her eyes fixed on her plate, weeping silently. Not for me, but for the scene. Beside her, my brother Julian, and smirked behind his wine glass. He looked like the poster child for success in his rented blazer, picking at a roll while my life was being dismantled. "Get out," my father roared, and his voice shaking the crystal in the cabinet. "I don't want to see your face when I wake up tomorrow. You're 30 years old, Leo. You're a leech, a parasite, and I'm done carrying your dead weight. Go live in the streets where you belong." I didn't flinch. I had learned years ago that flinching only made him swing harder, and I wiped a spot of gravy from my wrist with a napkin, keeping my movements slow, deliberate. The air in the room felt electric, and charged with decades of resentment that had finally found its spark. "You're kicking me out on Thanksgiving," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "After I paid for the groceries. And after I fixed the boiler this morning so you'd have heat for your guests." "I don't care what you fixed," he spat, pointing a trembling finger toward the front door. "And Julian needs the room. He's starting a real business, a venture capital firm. He needs a home office. He's actually doing something with his life, unlike you, and rotting away on that laptop playing games all day. Pack your trash. If you're not gone in an hour, I'm calling the police and telling them you trespassed." I looked at Julian. He raised his glass in a mock toast, his eyes cold and dead. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had poisoned the well, whispering lies about my finances, and painting me as the failure to elevate his own delusions of grandeur. "Fine," I said. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. I walked past my father, and who was still puffing his chest out, waiting for me to beg. Waiting for the apology. Waiting for the submission that had defined my childhood. And I went upstairs to the small guest room I had been occupying for the last 6 months while I recovered from what they thought was unemployment. I packed my single duffel bag, and I took my laptop. I took the hard drive that sat on the nightstand, the hard drive they thought was full of video games. I walked back down the stairs. The dining room was silent, and they were already eating again. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound. They didn't look up as I opened the heavy oak front door. The wind hit me first, and November in Chicago is unforgiving. The cold bit through my thin jacket, sharpening my senses. I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me, and I stood there for a moment in the snow, listening to the muffled laughter starting up again inside. They were celebrating. They were relieved. The burden was gone, and my phone buzzed in my pocket. A single long vibration. I pulled it out, my fingers numb. It was an email notification from my bank. A wire transfer had just cleared. It was the final payout from the acquisition deal I had been negotiating for 8 months. The buyer was a global logistics conglomerate, and the asset was a proprietary algorithmic trading software I had built from scratch in that gaming room. The screen illuminated my face in the dark. Account balance 25,400 Zaudet Oder, and I looked back at the house. The warm glow of the windows looked different now. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a cage I had just bought the key to, and I scrolled down to my banking app's bill pay section. I found the recurring monthly transfer labeled Whittaker Household Expenses. It covered the mortgage, the utilities, and the country club fees my father pretended he could afford. I tapped Cancel Recurring Payment, then I tapped Block Sender. On my father's contact, I walked down the driveway, and the snow crunching under my boots, and hailed an Uber Black. I wasn't going to the streets. I was going to the Four Seasons, and the game had just begun. And before I tell you the rest of this story, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Are you in your car, driving away from a job that doesn't respect you? And are you in a kitchen, cleaning up after people who didn't say thank you? Drop your location in the comments. I want to know where the survivors are. And because if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been the invisible one in a room full of loud voices, this story is for you. To the outside world, and the Whittakers were American royalty. My father, Richard, was a consultant, a vague title that covered up the fact that he hadn't held a steady job since the late 90s. And he lived off a dwindling inheritance and the appearance of wealth. He wore Brooks Brothers suits to pick up the mail. He drove a leased Mercedes he couldn't afford to put gas in. My mother, Elena, was the architect of the illusion. She chaired charity committees for causes she didn't understand, and spending money we didn't have on gala tickets to maintain her social standing. And then there was Julian, the golden child. 2 years older than me, Julian was everything they wanted. and tall, charismatic, loud. He was the star quarterback who peaked in high school, the fraternity president who barely graduated. He had vision, he had potential. Every year. And Julian had a new $1 million idea. A crypto exchange, a luxury bottled water brand, an app that was basically Uber for dog walkers but worse. My parents poured every spare dime into his ventures. They remortgaged the house twice to fund his seed rounds. And me, I was Leo. The mistake, the quiet one. I didn't play sports, and I liked math, I liked systems. I spent my teenage years taking apart computers and putting them back together. To my parents, I was defective, I was the background noise. And if Julian was the protagonist of their movie, I was the extra who accidentally walked into the frame. The dynamic was simple. Julian spent the money, and I was expected to fix the problems. When Julian crashed his car, I was the one who drove him to work for months. When Julian failed a class, I was the one who tutored him. And I was the utility player, useful only when something was broken. But the real dysfunction wasn't just favoritism. It was financial cannibalism. My parents were drowning, and they were bleeding cash to keep up the fuckhead for the last 5 years. And ever since I graduated with a degree in computer science that they mocked as nerdy, I had been anonymously funneling money into their accounts, and I set up a shell corporation to pay the mortgage. I told them it was a banking error in their favor, or a restructured loan program. They didn't question it. They didn't want to know. And they just wanted the money. I moved back home 6 months ago, not because I was broke, but because I was in the middle of the most intense due diligence phase of my life. My software and Vector 9 optimized shipping routes for international freighters. It was complex, heavy work, and I needed a quiet place to code and handle the negotiations without the distraction of my own apartment in the city. I told them I was between jobs. It was a test, and I wanted to see if they would love me without the paycheck. I got my answer at the dinner table. They didn't just fail the test. They burned the Scantron. And the wound didn't start that night. It started when I was 7. I remember winning the school science fair. I built a working radio out of scrap parts. I ran home, bursting with pride, and holding the blue ribbon. When I got there, the house was dark. They had all gone to Julian's T-ball game. They didn't come home until 10 at night. They brought pizza. And when I showed them the ribbon, my dad just said, "That's nice, Leo. Now clear the table so Julian can eat." He hit a double today. That was the baseline. My achievements were invisible. Julian's failures were celebrated as brave attempts. I learned to build in the dark. I stopped showing them my grades. And I stopped telling them about my projects. By the time I was 22, I was running a freelance coding business that made 6 figures. They thought I was working at a help desk. And I let them think it. It was safer. If they knew I had money, they would drain me to fund Julian's next catastrophe. So I built my empire in silence. I lived below my means. And I wore generic clothes. I drove a 10-year-old Honda. I invested every cent back into my code. I built Vector 9 module by module, night after night while they slept upstairs. And the silence of the house at 300 a.m. became my sanctuary. That was where I was powerful. That was where I was a king. But the "go live in the streets" comment. And that wasn't just dismissal. That was an eviction from the only safety I had ever tried to provide them. I spent the first night at the Four Seasons staring at the ceiling, and the luxury of the room felt alien. 600 thread count sheets, a view of the skyline, silence. The next morning, the anger had cooled into something sharper, clarity, and I opened my laptop and started to dig. If they were desperate enough to kick me out to give Julian an office, something had changed. Julian didn't need an office. And Julian needed a hideout. I pulled their credit reports. I had their social security numbers memorized from years of doing their taxes. What I found made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the mortgage, there was a business loan. A massive one. $300,000, taken out 3 months ago, the applicant, Leo Whitaker. And my heart hammered against my ribs. I clicked on the details. The loan was for tech infrastructure expansion. It was collateralized against my future earnings, specifically, and my freelance contracts, which had been exaggerated by 500%. They had forged my signature. I looked at the co-signer, Richard Whitaker. They had used my identity and my credit score, which was perfect, unlike theirs, to take out a loan for Julian. And looking at the payment history, it was already 30 days past due. And the realization hit me like a physical blow. They didn't kick me out because they hated me. They kicked me out because the bank was starting to call. And they needed me gone so they could intercept the mail. They needed me unreachable, so when the default notice arrived, they could claim I had fled the country or disappeared. And they were setting me up to be the fall guy for a $300,000 fraud. I sat back in the ergonomic chair. I looked at the snow falling outside the window. And the last thread of attachment snapped. The little boy who wanted them to look at his science fair ribbon died in that hotel room. I wasn't their son anymore. I was their victim. And I was now their creditor. I picked up the phone. I didn't call my parents. I called the most expensive forensic accountant in Chicago, and a woman named Sarah whom I had met during my acquisition talks. Then I called a lawyer named Marcus, a man known for destroying corporate raiders. Marcus, how big? He asked. Small for us. Massive for them? And I need you to acquire a distressed mortgage. The same target? Less, I said. And the Whittaker estate. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't exist. I ghosted them completely. And I saw missed calls from my mother, probably realizing the utility bills hadn't been paid. But I didn't answer. I stayed in the hotel suite, turning it into a war room. And Sarah tracked the flow of the stolen loan money. It hadn't gone to a business. It had gone to a luxury car dealership, a bespoke tailor, and a series of high-stakes online gambling accounts registered to Julian. They had stolen my identity to let Julian play big shot. Marcus went to work on the banks. And the bank holding the fraudulent loan was happy to sell the bad debt to a private equity firm for pennies on the dollar. They didn't want the legal hassle of a fraud case. And they just wanted it off their books. My shell company, Nemesis Holdings, bought the debt. Then we went for the house. My parents were 6 months behind on the mortgage. And the only reason they hadn't been foreclosed on yet was the state's backlog. Marcus approached the lender. We bought the note. By the 3rd week of December, and I owned the roof over their heads and the debt that was strangling them. I owned the car Julian was driving. I owned the clothes on his back. I was ready. I had Marcus send them a certified letter. It wasn't from me. And it was from Nemesis Holdings. It stated that the new creditor requested an immediate in-person meeting to discuss restructuring the default prior to legal action. And they took the bait. Of course they did. They thought they could charm a suit. They thought they could spin a story. The meeting was set for December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. I rented a conference room in a high-rise downtown, floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, intimidating, cold. I sat at the head of the table, facing the door. But I turned the chair around so my back was to the entrance. I wanted them to walk in and see the view first. I heard the door open. Hello. It was my father's voice. Uncertain. And we're here to see Mr. Vane. Please have a seat, I said, keeping my back to them. I lowered my voice slightly. I heard the shuffling of chairs. I really appreciate you seeing us, Julian said. His voice was oozing that fake charm. There's been a huge misunderstanding with the funds. My partner, Leo, he's a bit unstable. We're actually victims here. I smiled. It was a sharp, jagged thing. He was doing exactly what I predicted. Blaming the ghost. Is that so? I asked. Yes, my mother chimed in. Our son, he has mental health struggles. He stole our information. We're planning to file a report, but we wanted to speak to the bank first to show good faith. I spun the chair around. The silence that followed was louder than a gunshot. My father's jaw literally dropped, and Julian turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. My mother let out a strangled gasp, clutching her Chanel bag, which, technically, I had paid for. Leo, my father whispered. Did they call you too? I didn't get a call, Richard. I said. I didn't call him Dad. I am the call. I tapped the file folder on the table. I am Nemesis Holdings. That's impossible, Julian stammered. You're broke. And you're a bum. I sold my company 3 weeks ago for $25 million. I said casually, as if discussing the weather. But that's not what we're here to talk about. And we're here to talk about the $300,000 you stole from me. And the mortgage you haven't paid. I opened the folder and slid 3 documents across the table. I said, forensic tracking of the loan funds. Not a business, gambling cars. Clothes. Exhibit B. I continued. A sworn affidavit from the notary you bribed to fake my signature. He flipped on you for 10 grand. Cheap. Exhibit C. I finished. The deed to the house. I own it. And as of this morning, my mother started to cry. It was the same performance as Thanksgiving, but now there was terror behind it. Leo, please, we're family. We did it for us. For the family. You did it for Julian. I corrected. And you tried to send me to prison to cover it up. I heard you just now. And his unstable. He took off with capital. I leaned forward, clasping my hands. Here is how this ends. I have prepared 2 options. There is no negotiation. There is no option C. I held up one finger. Option 1. I hand this folder to the district attorney. Identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud. You will all go to prison. And Richard and Alina for at least 5 years. Julian, given the gambling debts and the direct spending, probably 10. Julian made a noise like a wounded animal. I held up a second finger. Option 2. You sign over all remaining assets to Nemesis Holdings to satisfy a portion of the debt. The Mercedes. The jewelry. The furniture. Everything. And you vacate the house in 48 hours. You leave Chicago. You never contact me again. If you do, I file the charges. Where will we go? My father asked, and his voice cracking. He looked old suddenly. The bluster was gone. He was just a small, defeated man. I don't know, I said, but I hear the streets are open. You told me to go there, and I'm sure you'll figure it out. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. You have 5 minutes to decide. The lawyer is outside with the papers. I walked toward the door. Leo, my mother screamed. You can't do this to your mother. I stopped. I didn't turn around. I don't have a mother, I said. I have a dependent who just defaulted. I walked out, and they signed. They didn't have a choice. The fear of prison was too real. The aftermath was clinical. My team handled the eviction. I didn't go back to the house, and I had no desire to see the empty rooms or the ghosts of my childhood. I had the house emptied. We sold the furniture, the car, and the heirlooms at auction, and the proceeds went to a charity that teaches coding to underprivileged kids. My parents moved to a small 2-bedroom rental in a run downtown in Ohio, and where the cost of living was low enough for their social security checks. My father got a job greeting people at a hardware store, and my mother had to stop dyeing her hair and pretending to be an aristocrat. Julian took the hardest hit. Without the funding and the safety net, he crumbled. And he couldn't get a loan because his credit was destroyed by the default I pinned on him legally before acquiring the debt. Last I heard, he was working shifts at a warehouse and scanning boxes. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was finally working in logistics. He was working for a company that used my software. Every time he scanned a box, and he was using a system I built. As for me, I didn't buy a yacht, I didn't buy a mansion. I bought a small, modern apartment in the city with a view of the lake, and I furnished it with things I liked. I built a computer rig that was a work of art. I spent Christmas Day alone. I ordered Chinese takeout. I sat by the window, and watching the snow fall over the city lights. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel lonely. I felt solitude. There is a massive difference. And loneliness is the absence of people you want. Solitude is the absence of people who hurt you. I took a bite of an egg roll and toasted my reflection in the window. I had lost a family. And yes, but I had found myself, and the trade was worth every penny. So here is the truth I want to leave you with. They will tell you that blood is thicker than water, and that is a lie people tell to keep you trapped in toxic cycles. And the full quote is, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. The bonds you choose are stronger than the biology you are forced into. If you are the scapegoat, and if you are the fixer, if you are the invisible one, stop trying to be seen by people who have their eyes closed. Stop building castles in their backyard. Go build your own kingdom. And they told me to go live in the streets. I did. I just bought the street first. You have power you don't even realize yet. Stop giving it away. I'm Leo. I'm out.